Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very welcome to this seminar. It's co-organized between Peterson Institute and the TradeExperettes. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at Peterson, and I'm very happy to moderate this seminar. I'm also a proud member of TradeExperettes. It's a network of women involved in trade all over the world, and Hannah will tell you more about it in a little while. I know many of you have been talking and thinking about tariffs lately. We're not going to talk about tariffs today, at least not as a main course. But we will try to look at more constructive areas, positive areas. What can we do to support and facilitate digital trade? How can we draw the potential of digital trade in innovation, in growth? What challenges does it put when it comes to global rules and regulatory frameworks, etc.? And I have a fantastic panel to discuss this. We will start with Hanna Norberg, who introduces the topic. She is an economist from Lund in Sweden and also the founder of TradeExperettes. And she's done a lot of impact assessments for the European Commission on trade agreements, etc. We also have Mr. Joshua, excuse me, Joshua Meltzer, who is a senior fellow just across the street at the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. He has done research on AI, on trade, and the intersection between trade and technology. We have Martin Schorzemba, who is from this house, a senior fellow here at Peterson. He has done a lot of research on China, on technology, on financial regulation, and on China and financial regulation and technology. And we also have Kat Duffy, who is from the Council of Foreign Relations, senior fellow there on digital and cyberspace policy. And she has done research on the nexus of democracy, technology, corporate responsibility, and human rights. So all these people are super qualified to talk about trade. And we hope that we will have some minutes at the end for questions from you as well. I will just say, because we're short on time, that here at Peterson we will host a lot of seminars, panels, and events during Spring Week with people from inside the house, but also invited guests from different parts of the world. They are all mentioned on our website, and if you regularly get Peterson's newsletters, you will get them as well, and you can sign up. Most of them will be here in-house, but you can also watch them virtually, and we have programs if you want to talk about it afterwards. So with this, Hannah, I will give you the floor, and after that, we'll directly move into the panel. So please, Hannah.
Thank you so much for that, Cecilia. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here today. As Cecilia said, I am the president of the TradeExperettes, and we are a global volunteer-powered membership organization dedicated to offering professional development and thought leadership in trade and in trade policy. And we have been very lucky to have the support of Peterson and of Adam Posen since our very humble beginnings. And now we're here. So this is our first co-branded event, and I have very much enjoyed this idea and to have the opportunity to put together this panel and have Cecilia moderate. Despite the date, I hope that we can find some very productive and exciting opportunities to move forward and to find ways to collaborate globally. The title of our panel today is Shaping Tomorrow's Global Economy, or what we trade policy nerds usually call digital trade. But of course, digital trade is a misnomer. It's talking about using trade policy to go from creating rules in the physical to the digital world, and moving to making these rules when gravity, as we know it, is being upended in many senses of the world. Which is how I'll try to phrase this. But digital trade is what we talk about when we talk about different parts of global connectivity that not only pertains to trade, but living in the modern world. And there's not a lot of places where we can tackle these issues. So since the mid-90s, this has been tackled in trade policy in the US, and others are catching up. And it was also in TPP. But trade usually, trade policy was built on the notion that it's about buying something in one place and then moving it across borders. You would fill out an order and you would get something physical, you'd pay for it, and then have it collected. And it was mostly about agreeing on tariffs. We have ventured a little bit into services and a little bit into regulations, but mostly it was about goods and tariffs. But everything that held our rules together for trade policy and was in our gravity is about three things. It was about the things that were tangible. So trade is happening in tangible things that are bought and sold physically and moved. And what's interesting about that, or good about that, when you're making rules, is that you know what you ordered, you know when you got it, and you know when you actually have it. And then, so we have the tangible, and then there's a transaction that comes with an exchange of a money for a thing. You order the thing, and then you paid for it. This is all sounding very basic, but I'll get to it. And then also so that last T is that it's being transported. So things were usually shipped by boat, crossing a national border, and then there would be customs there to collect and check regulations. So in this modern, digitally enabled world, gravity is being upended. And the new trade, as we move from physical to digital, is going from, buying a physical piano to having a virtual one on your phone. And on the one hand, that offers a myriad of amazing opportunities for consumers and producers, and for SMEs in particular. And Martin will give us some great examples of that. But also, when these factors that are being used for our rules are being upended, our rules are also getting messy. And that has further knock-on effects. So first, a lot of things are no longer tangible. So we don't actually hold them in our hands, but we hold them in the cloud, right? They're no longer transported, or at least not straight transported from A to B. It doesn't pass a border. And what I think is most fascinating is that the whole thing about transactions might not be at all what we imagined. We don't often... There are many situations where we don't no longer pay for a thing, but we are the payment. So if you think about it, when you're using a smartwatch, your data is collected on, say, like your heart rate. So then every time your heart beats, you're actually doing international trade in this new scenario, which is very different. And the other thing, when we lose gravity, I'm going to hold on to that analogy, is that the rules and the effects of trade also spills into other policy areas. And so if you think about it, like we were talking about regulation, now that's a domestic sovereignty, but when you're making them on the World Wide Web, then these local regulations don't stop at your international border, but they might very well have global effects. And they are coming very quickly. So in the last 5 years, there's over 2,000 of these regulations. That's basically one a day. And then you have taxation. And so, as you're moving into the World Wide Web, your basis for your taxes erode. And which means that companies are not paying the taxes and paid where you are using the service, but actually where the company's headquartered. Which means that governments need to rethink that. So then that gets into the whole sticky, messy business of digital services taxes. And the same thing happens when we move into competition. So when the world goes flat, you outgrow your national borders, and competition also becomes a global issue. And that doesn't stop there. So things are getting stickier and way more difficult to manage on a digital scale. But that's only getting started, because once you add to that whole thing, you go into AI, these complexities, they escalate. Again, bringing many new opportunities, but also difficulties, which Joshua is going to tackle in a second. And then what we're then finding is that these not only tools but experts and the networks that we use to do this is not going to work either. It's very much like the old picture of people talking about what an elephant is depending on what they're touching, but we don't even know what the animal looks like, and Kat will discuss. So without further ado, I just assume that it's better to just get into it, Cecilia. All right.
So we thought we're going to start with Joshua and then Martin and ending with Kat, and then a discussion between you and you. But without further ado, Joshua, why don't you start?
Thanks. Cecilia, remind me how many minutes? 5? 7? Okay. I don't want to go too long. No, there's nothing like best laid plans being upended by current events. So it's hard. I think it's really it's a great opportunity, I think, to talk about digital trade as possibly an opportunity space as we're being inundated, obviously, with tariffs and complete reordering of the international system. And I think it's worth just spending maybe a couple of minutes reflecting on these two juxtapositions, because we do obviously have, on the one hand, tariffs, obviously, which everyone is aware of, that were announced yesterday, on top of all the tariffs that have been announced since Trump's first term and his second term and so forth. And, it's no, I think, overstatement to say that we're seeing probably the most fundamental change in US international economic policy since, GATT and World War II, a complete attempt by this administration to reorder the international economic system into what is unclear, for what reason is unclear, but certainly that is the travel, I think, of direction that we're in at the moment. And it's worth, I think, also reflecting on the fact that a lot of what happened over the last 70 or 80 years in terms of international trade was premised fundamentally on a broad-based buy-in, I think, by governments, by industry and others, into the notion of comparative advantage, the idea that at the end of the day, each country was better off by liberalising. It was well understood there would be sectoral, specific, domestic impacts from trade liberalisation, but that was generally seen as a domestic policy issue that would be dealt with as each country saw fit, but the overall economic welfare of each country would be enhanced. And so the basic idea was there'd be more to go around, a bigger pie that could be used to compensate the losers. And I think it's fair to say that the US didn't do a good job of that. And I think it's also true, though, that businesses globally relied on this evolving international system to build very complex global and regional supply chains. And when we think about what's trying to be unwound here, I don't need to tell anyone in this room that, but it's clear that this is not simply a matter of purchasing widgets from one country. It's entire business models and supply chains have been built on the premise of agreements being followed, tariffs remaining fairly certain, and business and investment environments being relatively stable. And that's changing rapidly. And I mention that not simply because I think it's important to just sort of state that up front, given the moment we're in, but I think also it's important to think about this in the context of digital trade, because there's a huge opportunity, I think, for thinking creatively about how do we expand this area, because this is one area which is growing rapidly. It's potentially an opportunity for a lot of countries, and one which is arguably still fairly undeveloped when we think about the governance mechanisms and the rules that we have around it. But it's also one of the areas I spend a lot of time in, which is artificial intelligence, is one where it's not similarly underpinned by the types of kind of economic frameworks that have underpinned traditional trade in goods system. So we don't have a equivalent sort of comparative advantage framework to think about the opportunities and benefits from artificial intelligence, for instance. And so these differences, I think, are quite important when we think about what's achievable and what we expect to happen in this space going forward. You know, just stating very quickly on when one thinks about digital, and I just want to spend a few minutes on AI. I mean, I don't want to get into it in a lot of detail here, but you know, I think it's fair to say that this will be an epoch-changing technology. That will be a general purpose technology like electricity, and that will have impacts across economies, across sectors. It'll have economic impacts, social impacts, jobs impacts that we're really only at the very beginning of trying to understand. I mean, if you look at Gemini 2.5, which Google just recently released, you know, all the kind of in-the-weeds models suggest this is actually now better than OpenAI. If you look at like the agentic AI piece that's coming along, where you have agents that you get with, say, ChatGPT 4.0, it's incredible how quickly this has moved even from like 6 months ago. And so understanding the economic and jobs impact is sort of almost a process of trying to catch up and stay current. The other piece that's very different here is that this is very clear national security implications. And so that's the first piece. And we're obviously in a much more fragile national security environment as well. And the other piece is that it's heavily concentrated in the United States. And not only is it concentrated in the United States, certainly the large models, but it's actually been done by the private sector. I mean, this is the first technology of this kind of significance, I think, that is being developed outside of government, where government does not have a good look in terms of actually what the technology can do, what its trajectory looks like. It relies heavily, therefore, on access and cooperation with the private sector to kind of get that. And that's within the United States, where the companies are located, let alone in other countries where, you know, this type of cooperation is a lot more difficult. So I lay that out simply to say that I think that as we think about digital trade, as we think about the implications of AI for trade, it's quite a different sort of big starting point at some level than we've traditionally thought of with respect to the goods trade and so forth. Because it's a global technology with a lot of global opportunity, and you know, there's a debate that's been going on about how much we focus on risk and how much we focus on opportunity, and we just putting that debate to the side for the moment. What we have seen developed, you know, really over the last 5 to 7 years. This certainly happened during the Trump administration, so I do want to recognise that the Trump administration, I thought, was actually quite good on AI policy at the end of the day. And it's worth noting that a lot of the same people in the first Trump term are coming into senior positions in the second Trump term, so that may suggest some continuity on this front, which would not be a bad thing. And we've seen that it's been quite a multifaceted, disaggregated approach to AI governance. We've seen work going on in the G7, we've seen work going on in the OECD, we've seen bilateral arrangements with Europe. I don't think that'll survive, but I think that was potentially, you know, a useful thing to have. And we've seen some work in the trade front, right? So we've had in trade agreements, digital trade chapters, which have typically at their most ambitious, such as in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, talked about data flows and so forth. We've seen some trade agreements in Asia begin to pick up AI in those trade agreements and to go a little bit further. I think there's a real question now about what role can trade agreements play in sort of furthering the opportunity space and even the regulatory space around what's appropriate for AI. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, certainly, because a lot of these issues cash out in ways that are familiar to trade policy and law folk in terms of standards, in terms of mutual recognition agreements, in terms of services, trade, and so forth. And so there's a lot of issues that ultimately come up that are, I think, amenable to being dealt with in trade agreements. And you can imagine some innovative sort of developments in areas around cybersecurity and privacy, and trying to deal with issues around export controls, even at one stage, even though they're traditionally not in trade agreements. But there's a picture one can imagine which brings in some of the national security concerns, deals with some of the barriers, gets at some of the regulatory issues that animate Europe and other countries around AI, and that develops a more coherent kind of regional or global approach to AI that I think would work for everyone. But we have to, at the same time, I think, deal with what I was mentioning before, which is that this is not premised on comparative advantage in the same way I think that we have traditionally thought about goods trade. And so I think we need to be sensitive to what that means in terms of how these developments proceed. The final thing I'll say is that the WTO obviously has had a go. I think it kind of trying to have developed some rules around that with the WTO, the Joint Statement Initiative in e-commerce. We can talk about this more on the panel. I mean, I don't think that's going to go anywhere from a US perspective, but I think it underscores that there is a multilateral kind of interest in these set of issues. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. I am excited to be here. I usually work on finance issues, but this actually makes a lot of sense because financial services is often a digital service itself, but is also essential to trade in every other kind of service and in physical goods. So it kind of bridges all of this together. And the Chinese government, while I was focused on Chinese financial regulation, was always exhorting the financial sector to serve the real economy. And a cross-border payments is one way that finance can really serve the real economy. This is one, goal that China has that's not nefarious in any way, and it's actually beneficial to everybody. So the elephant in the room is obviously the yesterday's action, and one response I think many countries should be thinking about is to, when the U.S. is so uncertain, is to continue integrating with each other, and payments is one way that you can help that. I'm going to address three questions. The first is, what do cross-border payments look like today? What are the stumbling blocks that make those often a barrier to trade rather than something that facilitates trade? And then finally, how this can be resolved and why it matters. So what do payments look like today? One interesting fact is digital payments have really revolutionized many individual countries' financial services sector and payments within a country, but it's much more complicated to make this work in a cross-border way. That's because you have to often cross jurisdictions. Well, you always have to cross a jurisdiction. That can mean dealing with 2 or even 3, maybe even more currencies, multiple anti-money laundering regimes, multi-privacy regimes, consumer protection regimes. Sometimes the requirements in these regimes actually are incompatible, and you have to try and cobble something together that will allow a payment to flow from one jurisdiction to the other without anybody breaking the law. And that is a major challenge. Ideally, the system will work in such a way that all that complexity is handled in the back end, and someone who actually wants to make a payment, either a consumer or a small merchant, can do so without really worrying about it at all. It just kind of works. One of the most striking features of today's way of doing cross-border payments is the extraordinary reliance on the dollar, far more than the share of the U.S. in global trade. So about half of trade in the world is invoiced in U.S. dollars, and in Asia in particular, about 75% of imports and exports are invoiced in dollars. So the U.S., if you think about the impact of tariffs versus access to, potentially conditioning access on U.S. financial infrastructure, that financial infrastructure point is even more critical to the world economy than the U.S. consumers would be. One challenge is that right now access to this infrastructure is actually quite limited in many countries. In Asia, for example, only a few countries have direct representation. And what that means is that if you are a customer of a small bank in, say, India, you might have to deal with multiple domestic financial institutions to finally reach up to someone that's big enough to be, a direct participant in this infrastructure. You pay a little toll, and it adds a little bit of extra complexity and time every time you move from one institution to the other. And this can often get in the way of making trade work well. And that network of banks has actually been shrinking, which means individuals in these jurisdictions and businesses often have to deal with more and more hoops than they did in the past, because many banks don't want to serve what they see as, the big U.S. banks don't want to serve potentially risky smaller banks in other jurisdictions. And another problem is that there's been slow and uneven adoption of new international standards, so that many of these payments institutions are not even speaking the same language. Another, which gets more to the core of the trade issues we're talking about, are trade barriers. So one is data localization rules, which make it difficult for international payments providers to serve a jurisdiction. It can be a lot more expensive and reduce the economies of scale if all the data has to be held there. And then you realize that you actually need that data to leave the country if you're having a payment leave the country, so that the recipient knows where that payment come from. And you can't localize that data, so this is a big tension. Another is that there are often limits on market access for foreign payment providers. Only about a third of the WTO members have implemented the GATS provisions on cross-border payments. So this, in 2/3, that means it has not been liberalized. And finally, there are also limits on accessing financial infrastructure, which de facto block out foreign firms. And now, what are the solutions? What can we do to actually solve this problem? One is consistent adoption of international standards. A lot of countries want kind of to adapt the standard to their own thing to make it proprietary. They think that's going to protect their domestic institutions, but often that ends up isolating them from the rest of the world. Another is expanding access to payment infrastructure for the US, but also these other countries need to think, okay, if we can't be as reliant on, if we can't count on access in the same way as in the past to US financial infrastructure, you have to think about ways to make payments that may not involve the US dollar. So far that's been very limited, it's been very expensive, but I think there will be a lot more interest in it. It doesn't work unless you're using common standards, it doesn't work unless you're interlinking your payment infrastructures and providing access to institutions of other countries. And so there are interesting ways to make that work. And then the third is digital trade agreements that include payments. CPTPP is one example that includes provisions that go far beyond tariff barriers to making sure that payment institutions and different signatories can participate in each other's market. Another is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which has gone even further, including encouraging interlinking of payment systems to facilitate trade. Probably the best example is the Australia-Singapore foreign FTA, which includes all of this plus licensing. And licensing is one tricky area. Countries can often use the thicket of financial regulations to block foreign firms from providing services there. China's maybe a great example. Despite the Phase 1 trade agreement under Trump 1, supposedly opening up China's market to US payment systems, they have slow-walked the licenses and made it very difficult for those firms to actually operate. Why is this worth doing? One is that actual, real reciprocal, not yesterday's fake reciprocal opening, means that local players in each of these countries will have more ability to build international networks. Individuals and businesses in their jurisdictions will be able to reach more directly the global networks that allow them to trade with more counterparties. That would increase competition, that drives down cost, makes it easier for exporters and importers. And I think that even if the US isn't going to be opening any of this anytime soon, it's worth it for the rest of the world to try and make a push and trade more with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. A lot of things to come back to there. Kat, please.
There we go. Better?
Yes.
You know, my first paid gig in tech policy was helping Goldman Sachs draft its Y2K due diligence record.
Ooh.
And so, you know, when we think about AI in particular, I like to, you know, I was part of the original hype cycle. There is not a hype cycle, I think, that I have not seen. And what has been really interesting, having come up through decades of internet governance and digital governance, is I think at this point, we do ourselves a disservice if we think of ourselves as like, I'm a tech policy person or I am a trade person, right? I think in the year of our Lord, 2025, a tremendous question that crosses all of our fields is simply data. The creation of data, the storage of data, access to data, and the transfer of data. And that is global in nature. And that has built our global economy. It is the source of all innovation and all potential transformation with artificial intelligence, right? It's not because we're going from having foundation models and having innovation to having deployment. And it is really going from innovation, going from having a thing to deploying it is the difference in my mind between innovation and transformation. We are not at the transformation stage yet. I would say we're on the precipice of it. But we're nearing it more and more each day. And so with that, you know, one of the things I'm really looking at, particularly with the shifts in US leadership and the US approach to foreign affairs and foreign policy, is the fact that everything we have built in all modern trade is based on the fact that we have a free, global, interoperable, and secure-ish, it can seem at times, internet. And that global internet and internet governance has been one of the primary consistent areas of US foreign policy focus since the creation of the internet that has been bipartisan. The US has never swayed in its dedication, not only to protecting an interoperable internet, but also to promoting it, to backing it with appropriations funding, with support for civil society work all over the world, with support for technology development, and with a great deal of diplomatic focus. One of the things that we have seen, I would say, over the last 8 years, certainly in the global internet governance space, is that the US's role, I would say, under the first Trump administration did not move significantly, but weakened. It was less of a policy priority, as was sort of global engagement to begin with. We saw with the Biden administration a real attempt to sort of regain ground there, but within the United Nations and within these the global digital, I'm not talking about the trade spaces, but the global internet and cyberspaces, we saw a real move as well towards trying to diminish the gains that China had made through the Digital Belt Road Initiative, particularly with the G77. And so we saw a much greater sense of outreach and a larger focus, especially in AI, on concepts like the SDGs, as opposed to civil and political rights, in a way to build bridges with the local, with the low and middle income countries, because in the United Nations, there have been many, many moves on global governance, and you were essentially whipping votes, right? And each one of those countries is a vote, and China has done a very good job of building up its relationships with those countries in order to then sway UN mechanisms and UN discourse towards more autocratic approaches to the internet and away from approaches that really center its interoperability and its free-flowing nature. And so there are two things that have kind of resulted from that. One, I think the dramatic shift that we're seeing in this current administration means that for the first time since the dawn of the internet, we can't expect the US government to carry that torch in the same way or with the same persuasiveness because of the damage that is being wrought with our bilateral and multilateral relationships writ large. The US simply won't have I think, the focus or the moral leadership space in which to carry that torch. But the second area of focus is that while the Biden administration was focusing greatly on building up its trust with G77 governments, it did not place an adequate amount of focus on protecting multi-stakeholder mechanisms within those global governance spaces. And so this is where we get back to the trade space. If you think about the rise of AI and you think about data, not only as a global commodity, but as the global underpinning for business, those who focus on business, the private sector, right, trade experts, need to be sitting at the table and need to be part of the decision-making process around how these broader infrastructural and architectural decisions are being made. But that's not an area traditionally where we see a lot of trade people sitting, because that's not trade, right? It's not econ, it's not trade, it's something different. What we've seen now is the rise of a couple of different narratives inside the UN, and in particular one treaty, the United Nations Convention on Cybercrime, that could have truly perilous impacts for global data flows, for global data protections, for access, could expose business to corporate espionage, could expose business to unprecedented levels of political risk. And that convention has simply carried through in the UN and is now on deck to be signed in Hanoi in October, with overwhelming support from most Western democracies. And there were really only a handful of businesses who were involved in those negotiations and pushing back on them. And so that, I would say, is a particular treaty within the UN space for trade people to actually click into a little bit, because over the next couple of years, protocols for the deployment of that treaty will be being developed. And I think that folks whose area of expertise relies on looking at data are going to be need to be looking very carefully at a treaty that is all about creating opportunities for different law enforcement bodies between governments to demand and access data and extradite people who have worked in or on that data at will. And that is really what this cybercrime treaty would do. So I think this is probably a moment where we need to be getting much more aggressively interdisciplinary among the multi-stakeholder space and not just the governments, because where we have, I think, traditionally relied on the US government to help to orchestrate a bunch of that inside of the international organizations, I don't know that we'll be able to rely on that in the same way. And so I think we may need to pivot in our spaces, be bringing more people who understand digital governance into trade spaces, be bringing more people who truly understand trade into the internet governance spaces, and try to get porous faster than we have in the past, because a lot of these are developing in spaces we don't tend to monitor from our different silos, but you'll see consistent trends across those spaces once you get people together to talk about them. And so with that, I'll stop, but that's the update from my side of the world.
Well, thank you all. That was very interesting. And even if you did highlight some of the challenges and problems, there was some kind of common approach that there could actually be something happening right now. Could we see, and you alluded to it most of all, Martin, could we see that a silver lining of what happened yesterday could be that countries, other countries, possibly some actors in the US, get their act together and try to work harder on either bilateral agreements on this, or even on the UN level, or regionally, as has been the case in the CPTPP. And we also have the DEPA agreement with New Zealand, Chile, Costa Rica, and Singapore. Yes. Is this something that you see happening? And could this be the effects of yesterday, when the shock has laid down a little bit, that to try to refocus on digital trade instead of commodity trade? You could all comment if you want.
So, yeah, a couple of observations. I think that it's worth reflecting on two things. One is obviously that the Trump administration seems to be paying no attention to services. The US has got a very large services trade surplus with globally, and this may be a good thing in a way, because I think attention from the Trump administration doesn't seem to be good.
Yet. Maybe it's coming.
Well, you know, it's a bright spot in the trade picture for the US, right? If you're thinking about deficits as kind of being the thing that matter. We obviously, we've had, you know, to your point, Kat, about consistency in US policy towards sort of the internet governance space, we've sort of haven't had that actually on the digital trade front. And we actually saw quite I think a good, you know, over Obama years, there was a TPP, which was very sort of first when it came to thinking creatively about digital trade. Obviously, Trump pulled out of that, but then they did USMCA, which has really the most sort of forward-looking, ambitious digital trade chapter. There was a bilateral digital agreement with Japan as well. But then we did see, obviously, during the Biden years, both essentially you know, when Catherine Tai essentially announced that the US was not going to get on board with data flow rules in the WTO, JSI outcomes, and also then they announced that they were not going to pursue those in the IPEF negotiations when the US was hosting APEC. And this was really a navel-gazing sort of DC exercise in that it was, you know, a concern ultimately about, I mean, I Googled the Reuters article when they announced that, and the picture on the front of the Reuters paper was of Senator Warren. So I think it just sort of like, you know, it was not Catherine Tai making the announcement. It was, so I think it just underscored that this was really a domestic democratic set of issues around this concern that trade rules were going to constrain what they wanted to do with anti-competitive, you know, antitrust action. And it was never really, I think, articulated in a convincing way what was lacking in the flexibilities that you get in the trade rules. And in fact, that's been somewhat broadened out for digital trade rules anyway. If you look at USMCA and TPP, that they couldn't do, right? Like where really did the rubber hit the road? And I think there was generally just this sense that, you know, we want to do a lot on antitrust. We want to really get at big tech, and we don't want to feel like constrained by that. The other piece was, I think the Democratic Party has, since 2016, begun to develop a certain animus towards large technology companies, you know, seeing them as, you know, being partly responsible for Trump winning the election. I think, broadly speaking, concern about the way that social media has been sort of poisoning the public square in the US. And so I think there was a turn away from technology generally in the Democratic Party post-2016 that was also caught up in that debate. And so, you know, we saw quite a pivot, right, in terms of where ultimately the USTR at least was when it came to these sort of leading edge digital trade rules around data flows and data localization and source code and so forth. So the assumption is that the Trump administration will sort of recorrect or rebalance. And the National Trade Estimates report came out on Monday, and so they had put back in digital trade barriers which had been taken out during the Trump administration, which I think is seen as a signal that they want to get serious about digital trade again. So I think then there's a question of like, what do they do going forward and what's the opportunity there? And it's a little unclear at the moment because the Trump administration still needs to work out what their policy is, I think, on AI in particular and digital generally. So there was an executive order which came out in January on removing barriers to American leadership in AI, which gave essentially 180 days to come back with a report. So that's by like June 22nd on what the AI policy will be. So I think we'll get a better sense then. But as I said before, you've got a lot of continuity in personnel. Michael Kratsios is head back in OSTP. David Sackton is knowledgeable about these issues and so forth. So I think there's a lot of like knowledgeable people around. So I expect we will see something come out shortly that will kind of set the scene for that. And then, there's a question about what do they do? And I think that there's some countries like the UK which are clearly looking to do trade deals that I think are recognising that maybe they do this sectorally initially before they build up to something comprehensive. I could envisage, I think, something that maybe brings in Australia, the UK, maybe Japan, because I think the set of issues that ultimately my sense is that would go into something that is digital would go well beyond what we've been seeing so far in terms of digital economy agreements. I think that would sort of include security elements. I think you would see some maybe issues around export controls being addressed in there. So I think it would be a broader set of issues. So I think you would start out with very close national security partners in order to do that. And that's why I think those countries maybe seem to me a natural starting point for that. So that's what I think we may see.
Anybody else wants to comment on this? Martin?
Sure. I mean, I think the three examples I gave are examples where when the U.S. was not exercising leadership and the U.S. was not moving forward in this, other countries were coming up with their own coalitions and making it happen. So I think that will continue, but I think they'll have to be it'll be a bit tricky in terms of this being framed as a response to the U.S. because, for example, there was this report that Japan, Korea, and China were going to respond jointly, and that got a very strong response and a denial from other countries. So that will be a bit fraught. One thing I think Josh raises a really important point is that services might be, and digital trade might be the areas where other countries decide to retaliate against the United States, because if that's where the U.S. surpluses are, that's where they have leverage. We've already seen a lot from the EU in this space, but China could respond as well, and it interacts really interestingly with the whole AI bit, because the U.S. is trying extremely hard through AI diffusion rule, for example, to have all of the cloud computing, or substantially all the cloud computing that runs AI models in the future, to be in the United States, or with US hyperscale data centers that are located elsewhere being less than half of global computing power. And they want the world to build on top of US AI models and not Chinese AI models like DeepSeek. There's an interesting question of whether the rest of the world is going to trust the U.S. in this case, whether they will want their own computing in their own country, and if they can't buy it from the U.S., it'll be an interesting question of whether China can produce enough, or someone else can produce enough advanced chips that they might buy and say, then we don't have to be subject to the U.S. restrictions. So it'll be a very interesting space to watch, because I suspect that many of the digital services exports we'll see in the future are going to be cross-border provision of AI.
Anna?
So I definitely hope so. And I think that we're seeing some signs. So we're seeing during the first Trump administration, we're seeing the DPAs coming up, and we're seeing that these middle powers are asserting power and stepping in. And even in the EU, the overregulation in the GDPR, the privacy that is a human right, personal, and that we're now seeing rumors that may actually, for the first time now, be discussed. So a softening of rules there. So I definitely see that as a possibility.
I think, never waste a good crisis, right? I just think there are fundamental questions to be asked right now around whether what we are seeking to are we actually seeking to return to something? Is there a status quo we do truly want to protect? Or instead, are we protecting for sort of certainty and incumbency? And if so, what opportunities does this create? I mean, it is absolute chaos right now, but we are where we are. And so in the same way that I think about AI a lot as, AI has essentially, for better and for worse, opened up space for all sorts of things that we thought had been litigated to be re-litigated. It's where everyone's PTSD now lives in the fights they did not win before. But we are seeing it fundamentally reshape the way that geopolitical alliances might look like. We're seeing massive investment from Gulf states into the US. For chip production, we're seeing Saudi Arabia shift its language around internet governance because it knows that if Saudi Arabia understands that they would need an interoperable internet in order to build out data centers, in the Persian Gulf and have huge data centers there. You're seeing a totally different level of security concerns that now exist because Africa has essentially been wired by Huawei. Right? So if you're running all of your data that you're trying to protect over Chinese, controlled internet fiber, then there's real questions. There's not a lot of clarity around those terminal points and what access the CCP might actually have to traffic. And I'm saying there's questions. I'm not saying yes or no on that, just there are open questions. So essentially we are in this moment of incredible upheaval, not only because of the US, but because of how quickly this technology is emerging. And it is a really fertile moment, I think, for some of us to look at what has been driving us crazy or has felt like it's been stagnating for years and years and say, well, if everything broke, can we repiece it together in a way that's actually better fit for future purpose? I'm going to be hopelessly American optimistic right now.
Well, that's
You're
not
welcome.
wrong today, I think.
Yes. That's my one cheerleader moment for the day, y'all.
Optimism is a duty, as Karl Popper said. It's open for questions for anybody in the audience who wants to put a question or a comment. Penny, please, you can go to the microphone at the center because we have people online as well. You're very welcome as well.
Great, thank you. So, hi, I'm Penny Nass from the German Marshall Fund. Nice to hear all of you today, and I love the optimism. I have a question because I think we're on the precipice of retaliation, and since for most countries there's not enough goods to tariff at rates that wouldn't collapse their own economies, some of what we'll probably see is actions taken against services, and that includes digital services. So I'm also thinking about the shipbuilding work that's going on in the United States at the moment, where we're now charging or have proposed to charge $1 million per port call for ships that have been made in China, which to me is an innovative way of going after a service. And I'm just curious how we should be thinking about some of the things you're talking about today in a world where there's not enough goods to counter tariff. So what happens to the US service surplus as a result? Thank you.
Well, that's not an easy one. Who wants to have a go at it? You want to start? You can all talk.
Yeah, I think that. So it's obviously unclear what countries are going to target and retaliate on. I think that there's a list of services, IP, which are exposed. It's for each country, it's going to be a little different. So if you think, I mean, so you know this better than anyone. I mean, if you think about Europe, like Europe's got a lot of options actually on the table, and it's really a question about how far down that escalatory path they want to give. I mean, to give you one example of a huge escalation would be like the SWIFT network is physically located in Europe, right? So you know, obviously there's a lot of options here. Services, you know, like supply chains, right? A lot of these services are sort of deeply actually embedded in supply chains. They're embedded in manufacturing. They're key inputs into a whole range of other industries. So we all know that these tariffs are kind of domestically harmful, just as retaliation is going to be harmful to the other country. They're going to have to think very sort of carefully about, you know, the cost benefits of all of these actions. But like I think yes, absolutely. There are elements there beyond, like if you think about Europe, where they Harley Davidson and bourbon and the typical list that gets hit in a trade kind of war type situation, given how extensive this potentially looks now. I think that range has to increase. I wouldn't be surprised if it starts to look a bit like services. But obviously the piece of that is that once you bring that into the calculation, then I think the US responds, right? I mean, the thing Trump has said is that I think the administration is very, they understand the risks of retaliation to the US economy. I mean, the fact that Trump has said very clearly that he's going to escalate, he threatened 200% on European champagne and so forth. He's sending those signals very clearly. He said that to Canada, he said that to Mexico. I mean, I think Europe will retaliate and other countries will retaliate at different levels. But, as you think about services, the escalation is probably also going to be on that side as well. So it's a question of strategy at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think China is an interesting example to look at because they tariffed tit for tat in the first trade war, and then recently some of the actions that both the Biden administration did and now the Trump administration have done have led to this asymmetric retaliation where they, instead of raising on specific goods, and they go after something else. And in this case, it's included their own export controls, so trying to cut the U.S. off from important inputs that China provides. And I think everyone's thinking about critical minerals, but people don't understand enough just how many little widgets embedded in all sorts of items just have no possible alternative provider other than in Shenzhen. And if you add up a few cents on a large quantity of things, you end up raising costs quite substantially on those goods. And if they decide to stop exporting them, that could lead to serious pain in a lot of places that people don't really understand. But China has been, after the first trade war, really thinking about where it can exercise this leverage. Another is that they've begun doing antitrust and other investigations into U.S. companies that could expand as well. These have been especially hitting companies that don't really produce in China. So I think they'll be very concerned about companies maybe like Apple, which actually are responsible for a lot of employment in China and therefore hitting them. I mean, they're hit really hard by the tariffs. But other companies that export services to China, including one that's currently under investigation, could be another way that they retaliate. And many other countries might end up looking at China and saying, maybe this is the way that we do it as well, this asymmetric rather than tit-for-tat tariffing on physical goods.
If I could just add one other quick point, taking it to a very micro level. It's going to be really interesting to see how American citizens respond to the ramifications of this, right? I've spent about half my career living in, developing countries essentially, and half my career living in America. And, where we really excel is you can buy things. You can just buy stuff and it's really fast and it's relatively cheap. And you saw what happened with eggs, right? Like people went crazy that eggs were expensive and harder to get. As these tariffs, as the widgets, right? As the extremity of this starts to hit, and it starts to hit in random congressional districts in Kansas, right? In Montana, in Nebraska, in Alabama. I think we may get to a point where you actually have American citizens caring about something like trade or tariffs and understanding it to a minimal degree for the first time, perhaps ever. And so again, just in other countries, the citizens are much more used to the vagaries of supply chains and things being available, not being available. Americans are not. And so the impacts of this, I think, on daily life will be so profound that it may be very interesting to see how Americans respond in terms of putting pressure on their own elected officials. And that may shift the checks and balances approach here a little more significantly than we would have otherwise assumed.
I think we're all rooting on American consumers to get up and to say something and to stop this, right? Because that's where the break is. In general, though, I think, Penny, to think about, and this, is services is where global trade is at. So since 15 years, there has trading goods has been decreasing, or not growing as fast, and services is exploding. So that's where the future is, and digital services in particular. But yeah, let's go, American consumers.
I mean, Korean beauty products are going to go through the roof. And when you take like those collagen face masks away from influencer culture, like, have fun.
Any last question? Yes, please. Then I know you need to go, so please.
Hello, my name is Akinyi. Thank you for this wonderful panel. So in the spirit of not wasting a crisis, how can we rethink partnerships? For example, global partnerships, for example, with the African continent. How can we rethink our interactions in light of looking for new partnerships, new supply chains? When we think of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the digital protocol has just been, has come to pass. So how can we rethink these interactions in a sustainable way rather than how it's previously been, where Africa has been an afterthought, or we can include them at the end with some development provisions in an agreement? How can we strengthen some of these forgotten partners?
Very important question. Anybody feels, Hannah?
Yeah, I'm thinking that the AFCFTA, that's where the light is in all of this. That's where the action is. The 50 African countries that are coming together and saying that let's increase trade. And that's also, I think, how Africa should interact with this administration, because that's how anything gets done if you want to stand up to this, because the AGOA was thrown out. Kenya is not looking so good. But if the AFCFTA can come together, then that's a real opportunity, and just for Africa, but also with Africa.
I think that there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. One of them is that, and you see this with Canada, but I think it's going to be true with Africa, and it's going to be true with Southeast Asia, which is that as the US becomes less reliable as an actor globally, as a market certainly, then the need to address regional trade barriers to strengthen regional markets, I think, becomes more important. You see this in Canada, where there's a huge amount of provincial barriers, so they're going to look at that, and that's an opportunity for Canada to strengthen itself domestically. I think that'll be true of Africa, where there's foundations now to support inter-African trade. That should be more of a priority. It should be clear that that's going to have to matter more, because a lot of countries are still, ultimately, they can use inter-regional trade, but when you've got very long-established relationships with very large markets like the US, it's hard to create the incentives to be active and proactive and to move quickly. And I think those incentives are changing rapidly. So I think that, in part, is the opportunity space that we see over time.
Okay, if you thought I sounded Pollyannish before, wait till this. I think there's actually a moment here for a redoubled conversation around local and regional digital governance policies that are based in fundamental civil and political rights and fundamental human rights, particularly human rights to privacy and due process. And that is because the digital solidarity narrative that China has been pushing for years and years is very much about how, the internet may be borderless, but countries and nations should be able to govern sort of how the internet is working in their countries and what is being done on it and with it. And through that, we have also seen, many governments trying to exert greater local control over essentially digital companies. So this is where, data localization laws, requirements for data to be held locally, requirements for data registration officers, right, or registered officers, hostage-taking laws. We've seen a rise of all of these, illegalizing of VPNs. India was trying to require that every VPN would be logging all activity that could then be subpoenaed by the Indian government, which defeats the purpose of a VPN. So That is really antithetical to business interests, right? You can't, if you have to store your data locally, you don't know exactly how it would be protected, and the government can access it at any moment. And let's say that the government is accessing that through a Chinese company it has contracted with to build out some of its AI deployment, then you also don't know if what your data is then, or whatever has passed through that server is then potentially accessible by the CCP through a demand to a Chinese company that is in contract with that government. There's just a whole wedding cake of layers of complexity here where I think you can lean in and say, you know, there's going to be some fundamental standards around privacy, some fundamental standards around due process, some fundamental standards around extradition. And since this cybercrime convention is very focused on data and data access, but is really centered in law enforcement, and the desire of law enforcement and governments to go after actors or go after data, there is a unique moment, especially with that convention, for the private sector to come in much more aggressively and help shape the way that that's going to be rolled out, so that we can use that space to try to standardize better practices and better protections that business can actually build on top of.
Any last words? Well, that's great. So we have two conclusions. First of all, there is light in the tunnel. There is some scope for optimism despite the gloomy times. And secondly, all these things will lead to American consumers being more informed about trade policy and tariffs, which is a good thing. I think all over the world, people are talking about tariffs right now. So you've been a great panel. Hannah, Joshua, Kat, Martin, thank you so much. Join me in a big hand of applause for our panel. And you've been a great audience. Thank you very much.